Long. I'm Mike Rasmussen. My first connection to this church is through Alan Hawkins, Melinda's husband. So I was his seminary professor for Hebrew and Greek years and years ago, way back in the day. So it's been too long. I missed y'all. Great to be with you. It's always a tough act to follow right after the cute little kids. Some of you may know I work part-time. I'm on the faculty and an administrator for a theological seminary and church planting ministry in Russia. And y'all support our ministry, so before I preach, I just wanted to thank you again for being supporters. And I think that there will be, of course I don't know, but my guess is that there will be some kind of an armistice over the next couple of months so that we will be able to resume our trips to St. Petersburg, our vision trips. So if that happens, as I think it will, then we will send some of our Russian propaganda to you to invite you to come to St. Petersburg on one of our vision trips. So that info would come in the fall. So the Genesis flood, the plot line, as was just expertly reviewed by our children's ministry teacher. The storyline of Noah and his ark is so familiar, so well known, that Noah has actually been named the patron saint of accountants. Because as every little one who's been to Vacation Bible School or Faith Presbyterian Church, Children's Church knows, that the animals boarded the ark 2 by 2, so Noah has been named the patron saint of accountants because he employed a double entry system to float a limited company while the rest of the world was in liquidation. So, and thankfully I'm not here all week, but so this morning we're exploring 3 takeaways and perhaps new thoughts for you, 3 takeaways from the Genesis flood, 3 central things for you to hold on to when floods come in your life. And so we're not going to look at questions like when did the flood happen, or was it worldwide or regional. I believe it was a real thing with real water, but we're not going to get into those kinds of questions. And before we get into our 3 takeaways, there's one really important piece of background information that we'll need to look at, because our 3 takeaways come from this background information. 173 years ago, 1852, archaeologists were exploring near the city of Mosul, Iraq. They were exploring the city mound of the ancient city of Nineveh, and they were exploring around the palace of Assyrian king, Emperor Ashurbanipal, who is mentioned by name in the Old Testament. And they came across an enormous cache of clay tablets, 30,000 clay tablets, that has come to be called the Palace Library of Ashurbanipal. And these clay tablets had cuneiform writing on them, wedge-shaped letters put into wet clay. So, of course, scholars went to work translating those clay tablets, and pretty soon it was discovered that Noah was not alone, that there is a parallel flood account, the Mesopotamian account of the ancient flood. And it's called the Gilgamesh or Atrahasis epic, and it traces all the way back to the Sumerians in the 3rd millennium BC. 3rd millennium BC. So when did the Israelites begin to put the Old Testament in writing? Well, it was somewhere around 1300 BC. So this means, and stop and think about this for a second, this means that the Mesopotamian flood story is at least 1,000 years older than the Genesis flood account. The parallels between the two are unmistakable. For example, in both accounts, the God or the gods is going to send a giant flood to wipe out humankind. In both accounts, one man is let in on the secret. In both accounts, this man builds a giant boat and waterproofs it with pitch. In both accounts, when the flood subsides, the man sends out a dove and a raven to test and see if it's time to leave his giant boat. And in both accounts, after he leaves the boat, he worships and offers sacrifice. So there is no doubt that Gilgamesh and Noah are related. They're reporting the same event. Since the 1950s, copies of the Gilgamesh epic have been unearthed in Israel, in Syria, and in Turkey. It was widely known the Mesopotamians were far more influential than the tiny country of Israel up in the hill country. The Mesopotamians had 10 times more TikTok followers than the Judeans had. So the folks who wrote the Genesis flood account already knew about the Mesopotamian flood account. Gordon Wenham is one of the more reputable Old Testament scholars alive on planet Earth today. He's in his 80s now. He's getting up in years. And he is a scary little man, very smart English man who was the external reader. That's the main grader for my dissertation at the University of Aberdeen several years ago. And here's what Gordon Wenham says about Genesis, quote, "Genesis is not simply reproducing ideas of surrounding cultures. Genesis is contesting those ideas fiercely." End quote. So the Genesis flood account, one helpful way to think about it is it's in debate. It's asserting truth against falsehood, against a well-known, pre-existing piece of literature. Okay, so I'm expecting that might rattle your cage just a wee tad. But okay, 3 takeaways. The first one is the Bible is grounded in history. This kind of information that we've just reviewed, it may seem unsettling at first, but at the end of the day, it supports the authority of Scripture rather than calling it into question. Because the trustworthiness of the Bible is enhanced by the fact that it came to us through historical processes. In this case, it's the history of literature. Because believers in ancient Israel, who they're in relationship with the true God, they are arguing against deceptive, unhelpful literature. So in my book, that's a plus, not a minus. So the Bible stands unique among the world's religious books, unique because it is grounded in history. In this case, it's the history of literature, of ancient Near Eastern literature. It's grounded in history rather than in contrived mythical ideas. So let me just suggest a little experiment for some of you about how the Bible is grounded in history. Read the first few chapters of the Bible, and then as a comparison, read the first few chapters of the Quran. And I think you'll notice the difference, because the first few chapters of the Bible read as something that is grounded in history, in space and time, telling a story of one God who's working out his plan. And the Quran, on the other hand, reads as if one single person is receiving disorganized visions from who knows where. So run the experiment yourself if you like, the first few pages of the Quran, the first few pages of the Bible. So this kind of information actually supports the authority of the Bible rather than calling it into question. And here's one reason why I bring it up. If we wish to retain our intelligent, thoughtful children unlike me who was playing the role of the dumb, stupid jock in high school, if we wish to retain our well-informed, thoughtful children in the Christian faith, in the church, it's better to put all the info on the table to approach these issues head-on rather than pretending they're not there or hiding them. Because this kind of information actually enhances biblical authority rather than detracting from it. Second takeaway has to do with the stated reason why the flood happened. And we're getting to the good stuff, I think. In the Babylonian flood version, the gods sent the flood because they were ticked off, because there were too many people making too much noise, disturbing their sleep. Quoting the Babylonian, "The land bellowed like wild oxen. The god was disturbed by their uproar. The god Enlil said, 'Oppressive has become the clamor of humankind. By their uproar they prevent sleep.'" Because, of course, if you're a Babylonian god or goddess, well, you need to get your 8 hours of good shut-eye to be able to perform your job description. So in their frustration, the capricious, unloving gods lashed out and killed. They sent a flood. In Gilgamesh, the pagan gods are a lot like Boris Karloff's Grinch, who hated the Who's in Whoville because of all the noise. Noise, one thing I cannot stand. It's all the noise, noise, noise. One thing I hate. So the Babylonian flood account, my friends, is a straight-up Malthusian population control event. The vindictive, self-centered gods thought there were too many people, so they just needed to knock some of them off. It places a pitifully low value on human life. And the Bible's corrective to that, the Bible's reason for why the flood happened could not be more opposite to that. Because in Genesis 6 through 9, we know God sends it as divine judgment on sin, well reviewed by our faithful deacon leading the children's ministry here. But when we read the flood account, Genesis chapter 6, 7, 8, 9, we do not find one single word describing God as angry or wrathful. This is important, my friends. Instead, what do we see? We see the broken heart of God over the wickedness and violence and lack of love among the human race. Genesis 6:5, the Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great on the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually, and the Lord regretted. That is the Hebrew verb nicham, which is to be sorry about some event, to change your mind about something. The Lord regretted, was sorry that he had made humankind on earth, and it grieved him, the Hebrew verb atzav, There'll be a quiz later, which means to just be pained inside of something that's just disturbing and saddening to you. It grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out humankind from whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals, creeping things, birds, and the heavens, for I am sorry, nicham, again, that I have made them. So, if we explore the foundation of God's salvation plan, the Jesus died for us, rose for us plan, a major part of that foundation is the broken heart of God, the compassionate concern of God for lost humanity, the way we behave. Years ago, I was putting in new kitchen cabinets, factory-made cabinets, doing a kitchen reno, and my wife had worked with a designer, and she had drawn up a plan, and so all I had to do was follow the blueprint. And if you've ever put in kitchen cabinets, you know that there is no rocket surgery involved. All you have to do is get them level and square where you want them, and you put in 2 screws through special part of the cabinet into the studs in the wall, and you're done. It's not that big of a deal. So I put in 2 kitchen cabinets, got them all square and level, fussed over them, and got them all just the way I wanted, put it in these 2 cabinets, and then I backed away to behold the glory of my accomplishment. Now, you do that, don't you? Yeah, of course you do. I stepped back and looked just to sort of bask in my own awesomeness for just a minute until I glanced at the blueprint, and then I noticed that I had failed to install a spacer between, as the cabinets were going up, a spacer between this wall and the first cabinet. Forgot the spacer. If I had kept going with my creative project, then the whole line of cabinets would have been all messed up. So with deep regret, nicham, and with a painness of heart, atzav, I put the screwdriver in reverse and backed out and undid my creative process. I had to undo what I had done. Well, you multiply those feelings that I had that day years ago, multiply them times infinity, and you'll see how Genesis 6 through 9 says that God felt, the text says how he felt about the wickedness and violence of humankind. So unlike the Babylonian account, across the 4 chapters of the Bible's flood account, there is not one single word, surprisingly, not one single word for wrath and anger. And I'm an ordained PCA pastor. We're more right-wing than y'all are, So I believe in the wrath of God, but I want to take things from the text and pay attention to the text. And what we're told is that God was sorry. So we mustn't allow our Calvinism to reduce God to a mathematical equation. The Genesis flood reminds us that God is love. When our sovereign God ordains disaster, whether it's a large one or a small one going on in your life right now, as no doubt some of us are living through disaster, when our sovereign God does that, there's a major aspect of which he does so with a broken heart. The idea that God is harsh in the Old Testament but gracious in the New is it's about as biblical as worshiping a watermelon. God is mean in the Old and kind in the New, and he's a 10-ton cosmic watermelon in geosynchronous orbit hidden behind one of the moons of Saturn. Those 2 things are equally accurate. So especially for those of us who are going through suffering now. And then especially when we look out at all the suffering in the world. And there's so much. I mean, I don't need to list it for you, but Christians there's a genocide of Christians going on in Syria as we speak. And on and on and on and on and on and on. That we have a compassionate God who has joined with us in our suffering. The problem of evil is bigger than our little pea-sized brains can figure out. Job, in the book of Job, does not get his question specifically answered. So it's bigger than us, but one thing we need to take to the bank is that God is not just some kind of a giant meanie up in the sky, that he has sent his Son to join with us in our suffering, which is part of what the cross is all about. So when we look to Jesus, Yahweh with sandals on, God with kneecaps, we see the very same thing. We see compassion towards sinners and compassion, pain felt toward the results of sin. As Jesus was predicting, as a Hebrew prophet, which he was, predicting that the Roman armies would destroy Jerusalem, he says, you can see he's mourning over the violence taking place in Jerusalem. He says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. How often have I longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing." So, are you going through a flood right now? The world is run by a calm, compassionate God, who is sovereign over events. When the flood comes, some kind of personal disaster, the world is not run by a cabal of capricious, impotent deities like the Babylonians thought. The world is not spinning out of control by accident, as some secularists might believe. The world, your world, the floods that I'm having to deal with in my life, they are ordained by one calm, compassionate God who is sovereign over events. When all hell breaks loose, your Father in heaven is still running things. There's still a human being with his hand on the tiller of planet Earth, the crucified, resurrected Son of God. For God so loved the world. Third and final takeaway has to do with the outcome of the flood, the end game of the flood. At the end of the day, looking back at this awful event, what can be learned from it? This is my favorite comparison with the Babylonians. Because the Babylonians kind of shrug and say, well, not so much. There's not much that can be learned. It says that the gods sent the flood in an unreasoning manner. Unreasoning. So the Babylonian flood account ends with a whimper, with no rationale, with no word of explanation. Hey, bad stuff just happens. Nothing to learn here. Move along. So the Babylonian account could not be more different from the Hebrew account, because the Bible's flood account is the very first occurrence. Genesis chapter 6 is the very first occurrence of a very, very important word, the word covenant. It first occurs in Genesis chapter 6. It's extraordinary that the flood is the first place that we find this word covenant used. The Genesis flood is God redeeming a disaster. The Genesis flood is stage one of God's 5 covenant stepping stone plan. 1 covenant, 5 steps to save the human race, to forgive you, to renew you, and to renew all of creation. So Genesis 6:18, just before the flood happens, God says this to Noah, I will establish my covenant with you. Then the flood happens in Genesis 7 and 8. And then in Genesis 9, God amplifies and repeats this covenant idea. I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you. Never again will all life be destroyed. You probably know the verses. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of the flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. And then he promises the rainbow, which there is no Hebrew word special for rainbow. It's the word for a war bow. It's the word for an instrument of death. And God, it's like a soldier, warrior, hanging his bow up on the wall to use it no more. It's an instrument of death, similar in that regard to a cross, which is also an instrument of death. Verse 13 of chapter 9, I have sent my rainbow in the clouds. It will be a sign of the covenant between me and you. So the Bible's flood account, as we conclude here, the Bible's flood account is given to us utterly unlike the Mesopotamians had no eschatology in their belief system. The Mesopotamians did not have any idea that the gods were going to bring about, their gods, going to bring about a renewed, better situation on earth. No hope whatsoever, which is utterly unlike the Old Testament, which when God says to Abraham in Genesis 12, through you, all of the people groups will be blessed. It is in a little capsule. It's a promise that God is going to turn the fall of the human race into sin and death around, that he's going to fix the problem. So the flood is given to us in a covenant sandwich, with the flood in the middle in chapters 7 and 8, and the covenant promises on the outside. Very quickly, one covenant, 5 covenant stepping stones. Noah, Abraham, everyone's going to be blessed. Moses, the Torah. Here's how I want all of these sorry rascals and rascalettes to behave. Here's how to be godly. And now he's written that in your hearts, on your heart. So Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, 2 Samuel chapter 7, where God tells us that he's going to fix the problem on planet Earth through a king, through a human king. And then Jesus, who, when we take the Lord's table together, we are using the C-word covenant all the time. When he had the Last Supper with his disciples. This is the new covenant. This is, I am the end of the line. I am step 5, the final step in God's 5 stepping stone covenantal plan to save the human race and to restore and renew history. So a 5 stepping stone trail, beginning with Noah, ending with Jesus, beginning with the suffering of the flood, ending with the suffering of Jesus, beginning with divine judgment on sin at the flood, ending with divine judgment on sin at the cross. So unlike the pessimistic existentialism of the pagan account, so unlike it. So when Jesus said, this is the new covenant in my blood, one of the things he meant is that, hey, I'm the end of the line, tracing all the way back to Noah. Only in the Bible, as we conclude, only in the Bible does the destruction of the world become God's opening gambit in his plan to save the world. And I know when I go through suffering, the temptation is to not put it in context. The temptation is just to say, oh, this is awful. Why would a good God, you can get a little bit, even though you know it's stupid to do it, you can get a little ticked at God. And it's like you're in a little silo, only feeling your pain in a pity party. And I'm not trying to belittle your pain in any way. But the Genesis flood story, especially when we put it in contrast with the pre-existing pagan account, and we look at the points that these very smart Hebrew people from way back are trying to make to us. It says, get out of your silo. The suffering that you're going through is, even though you can't figure it all out, it's part of God's big plan of what he is working in your life and the people around you and in all the world. So this is one thing you need to remember next time a flood hits in your life. God is working his plan. He will bring you through the waters, whatever those may be. The Congo River is 10 miles wide, concluding illustration. The Congo River is 10 miles wide at spots. It's big. It flows in an arc shape through Central Africa. North of the Congo River is the habitat of the western lowland gorilla. Only north. South of the Congo River, there is not one western lowland gorilla. So why are there no western lowland gorillas south of the up to 10 miles wide Congo River? Well, it's really no mystery if you think a little bit about gorilla morphology. The average male gorilla is 5'4" tall and weighs in at a whopping 375 pounds with almost no body fat. This explains precisely why you've never seen a gorilla on an Olympic swimming team choosing to identify as a human being. Because gorillas, my friends, they sink like a rock. So, gorillas can't swim, even on their very best day. Of course, y'all are much better looking than a gorilla. But you do have that one thing in common with them. The Congo River it's really a watery death barrier. It's a watery, impenetrable death trap to gorilla well-being. Likewise, there are floods across which you and I cannot swim. And Christ, the crucified, resurrected one, has navigated the waters of death for you. A couple of verses from Psalms 18 and 69, and we close with prayer. Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. Do not let the flood waters engulf me or the depths swallow me up. The torrents of destruction overwhelmed me. In my distress, I called to the Lord. I cried to my God for help, and he heard my voice. He reached down from on high and took hold of me. He drew me out of deep waters. Therefore, I will praise you, Lord, among the nations. I will sing the praises of your name. Let's pray together. Father in heaven, we thank you that there is a resurrected man with his hand on the tiller of troubled planet Earth and of our troubled lives. We thank you that he is leading us through the waters. His name is Jesus. In his name, amen. Now we are going to sing, I believe,